Hi everyone, this is a one-part webinar with LMU's Writing Center on working with scholarly sources and writing literature reviews. A brief overview of the information we will be discussing today includes the general structure of literature reviews, the difference between analyzing and synthesizing sources, and when and how you should cite source information based on how you are implementing it into your paper. To start, what is the purpose of a literature review? There are a couple of different reasons, but the key thing to keep in mind is that literature reviews synthesize the existing scholarship on a particular topic. You might recognize the idea of synthesizing or reviewing sources from research materials you have worked with previously, such as annotated bibliographies. A key difference between lit reviews and annotated bibliographies, however, is that literature reviews come early in a research paper before the reader gets to the author or your original research contributions. Literature reviews are meant to set the stage and provide context for the next stage of conversation that will be pursued in the bulk of the paper. Literature reviews are written in paragraph format. They typically include subheadings that organize information by themes, and we'll talk a bit more about organizing source information later on. And literature reviews include more summary than quotes. Depending on your assignment, there may also be a need for an introduction and conclusion for your literature review. As mentioned earlier, literature reviews synthesize information in a way that may feel familiar if you have written an annotated bibliography. However, the key difference between the two is that while annotated bibliographies allow the reader to choose whether to explore available resources on their own, a literature review directs the reader to a particular understanding of available sources. A literature review heavily involves synthesis of information, reading through sources, finding connecting themes, and using those connecting themes to group the sources together, whereas annotated bibliographies typically just organize by source. Before you can get to the organization part and the writing of your literature review, you must first understand your sources and how they relate to each other. Take a moment now to ask yourself, what are some of the sources you have encountered so far and how do they relate to each other? Remember RADAR in reviewing and evaluating sources. The RADAR framework is an approach to evaluating quality and usefulness of information, and there will be a link to a LibGuide that describes more about this technique in the description below. This first step of understanding your sources can also be seen as analyzing your sources. Analysis requires reading a text deeply in order to break it down into its parts and make sense of it. You want to ask yourself, what is the article's main argument and which pieces of the article have contributed to building this argument? Some tips to help you in your analysis of articles are to annotate the text as you read it, highlight main ideas and important details, and to make notes in the margins. These can be things like summarizing sections of the text, showing connections between what you've just read and something that was said earlier, or maybe what you just read and something that was said in a previous source that you analyzed, and asking questions when you disagree or find a point confusing. It is important to note that you need to go through the stage of analysis before you can get to the stage of synthesis. While analysis requires the dissection of ideas, synthesis involves bringing ideas together in new ways to make new meaning. An example of the difference between the two is that an analysis of the heart organ might indicate that it is a muscle divided into 4 chambers which pumps blood in our bodies. A synthesis would show that the heart, blood vessels, and blood all work together to make up the circulatory system, which provides oxygen, nutrients, and removes waste from our bodies. The difference is breaking a whole into its parts versus finding parts from several different pieces to make one new whole. Synthesis is a crucial skill for writing a literature review. You'll need to show how the different sources that focus on a particular topic relate to one another and what they mean when taken together. Synthesizing is a skill that's highly dependent on identifying relationships between ideas. You want to look for similarities, trends, and patterns, as well as differences, divergences, and opposition. These may show up not only in the main arguments of the articles, but also in their publication context. For example, a research paper versus critical practice, the author's focus and purpose for writing, theoretical frameworks, research methodologies, kinds of supporting evidence, etc. Once you've found the places where your sources compare and contrast, the next major step is to figure out how to organize. Two options for organizing information in a literature review are by theme and chronologically. We recommend taking a thematic approach to organization because it is the more sophisticated way to make connections between sources. A reason for organizing sources chronologically would be if you wanted to look at how scholarly perspectives on a well-known and long-lived topic have shifted over time. Subheadings will help you manage whichever organizational strategy you choose for both yourself and the reader. Remember that you want to work against the mode of writing an annotated bibliography, where you work through your research one by one. You truly want to read every source that you have and look for the patterns across them before you start organizing, outlining, constructing your literature review. Organizational tools such as a graphic organizer or a mind map can help you plan out those patterns and connections. Keep your research question in mind as well. You are driving the reader towards a certain point to get them to agree to your viewpoint. That means building the narrative at every part of your paper, but in particular in this introductory section where you are establishing the conversation that has been happening. The key is to maintain control of the development of ideas in the literature review. Remember, only include source materials that help shape your argument. Resist the temptation to include everything you've read. You're driving your reader in a direction. Stay focused on that path. Here is a sample of synthesis at work in a literature review. Feel free to pause and read. This sample is from The Effects of Communication Styles on Marriage Satisfaction, and it will again be linked below. This is an example of a mind map that you could use to track the synthesis amongst your sources. This writer has their research question at the center. From this point, the writer can then ask, what does the reader need to know about the topic? What kind of sources do they need to find in order to do the work of explaining the research topic adequately? Think about your sources as pieces of a puzzle that you will put together for the audience. So maybe there is a key term that your audience needs to be aware of, so you have a subheading for that. Perhaps there are specific research methods that are also pertinent to your research question that you, again, want the audience to be aware of before you dive into your topic. That would be another subheading. Thinking about your project as a puzzle can help you figure out what kind of sources to search for, as well as discover an effective thematic organizational structure for your literature review. Now that we've talked about analyzing, synthesizing, and organizing your sources, how do you then integrate these sources into your writing? There are three main options for integrating your sources. Summarizing, where you place an idea into your own words, but more concisely than expressed in the original. Paraphrasing, which is similar to summarizing in that it is again in your own words, but you pay more attention to details. Be aware that this requires more than just changing one or two words from the original. Paraphrasing should be perceived as if you were trying to teach this concept to somebody else, but in your own words. And then there is quoting, where you take the words exactly as they are in the original and you show that by using the appropriate punctuation. Note that no matter whether you are summarizing, paraphrasing, or quoting, if you are referencing somebody else's words, that requires a citation. In literature reviews, you most likely want to quote infrequently and focus instead on summarizing and paraphrasing. Always make it clear to the reader whose ideas are whose. either through signal phrases or citations. Given that literature reviews are mostly focused on the voices and thoughts of others, you will be citing a lot and it may feel like too much. But remember that you are pulling in information and research that has been collected by others in order to set the framework for your own thoughts. Even with that being said, don't let your own voice get lost when you are bringing in all of these additional thoughts and voices of others. Before we go, we would like to leave you with a bit of independent practice. Take a look at the list of sources you have curated. With that list, create a graphic organizer that shows patterns in and connections between your sources. List the themes you've identified that could then become subheadings for your literature review. If you'd like an example graphic organizer or mind map, you can look in the description box below for a few samples that we have provided. This is a brief webinar and literature reviews can be very intimidating. So as always, we want to encourage you to take advantage of your resources on campus and visit us at the Writing Center. You can make an appointment online by going to My LMU, Academics, and Writing and Course Tutoring. We also have webinars on APA format and citation and writing with sources in general, which will be linked below, but also can be found on our website, academics.lmu.edu/arc/writing center. Tutors can help with written text, citations, speeches, and presentations.